absolute, infinite concept of universal peace and goodwill, of which some fantasies and fanatics dream. I do not deny the value of hopes and dreams, but we merely invite discouragement and incredulity by making that our only and immediate goal. Let us focus instead on a more practical, more attainable peace, based not on a sudden revolution in human nature, but on a gradual evolution in human institutions, on a series of concrete actions and effective agreements which are in the interests of all concerned. There is no single simple key to this peace, no grand or magic formula to be adopted by one or two powers. Genuine peace must be the product of many nations, the sum of many acts. It must be dynamic, not static, changing to meet the challenge of each new generation. For peace is a process, a way of solving problems. With such a peace, there will still be quarrels and conflicting interests, as there are within families and nations. World peace, like community peace, does not require that each man love his neighbor. It requires only that they live together in mutual tolerance, submitting their disputes to a just and peaceful settlement. And history teaches us that enmities between nations, as between individuals, do not last forever. However fixed our likes and dislikes may seem, the tide of time and events will often bring surprising changes in the relations between nations and neighbors. So let us persevere. Peace need not be impractical, and war need not be inevitable. By defining our goal more clearly, by making it seem more manageable and less remote, we can help all people to see it, to draw hope from it, and to move irresistibly towards it. And that the political aims, and I quote, of the American imperialists are to enslave economically and politically the European and other capitalist countries, and to achieve world domination by means of aggressive war, unquote. For we are both devoting massive sums of money to weapons that could be better devoted to combat ignorance, poverty, and disease. We are both caught up in a vicious and dangerous cycle, with suspicion on one side breeding suspicion on the other, and new weapons begetting counter-weapons. In short, both the United States and its allies, and the Soviet Union and its allies, have a mutually deep interest in a just and genuine peace and in holding the arms race. Agreements to this end are in the interests of the Soviet Union as well as ours, and even the most hostile nations can be relied upon to accept and keep those treaty obligations, and only those treaty obligations, which are in their own interest. So let us not be blind to our differences, but let us also direct attention to our common interests and the means by which those differences can be resolved. And if we cannot end now our differences, at least we can help make the world safe for diversity.
John Kennedy's speech at American University in June of 1963 showed his commitment to a peace process for resolving differences while reducing arms and the risk of armed conflict. This followed his close call in the Cuban Missile Crisis of the previous October, where his military staff recommended an assault on Cuba, which could have led directly to nuclear war with the Soviet Union. Kennedy's direct diplomacy with Khrushchev turned out to save the day and end the crisis.
With the crisis escalating, new hope of a diplomatic solution comes from an unlikely source. ABC reporter John Scully meets with a Soviet diplomat known as Alexander Fomin at the Occidental Restaurant in Washington, D.C. He had talked with State Department officials and had been briefed on how to handle the conversation. In Moscow, Khrushchev composes a personal and emotional letter to Kennedy, appealing for an end to the crisis. He offers to remove the missiles in return for Kennedy's promise to end the quarantine and not invade Cuba. XCOM thinks that Khrushchev, or some new hardline element in Moscow, is adding further demands: the removal of U.S. Jupiter missiles from Turkey. Airstrikes preceding the invasion of Cuba are set to start tomorrow, unless Kennedy and Khrushchev can find a way out. In Washington, the president decides to send Bobby Kennedy to meet with Soviet ambassador Anatoly Dobrynin and make an offer. The Soviets would dismantle and immediately remove their missiles from Cuba. The U.S. would end the quarantine and promise not to invade Cuba. But the Kennedys secretly offer one more, very substantial incentive. The U.S. would also remove NATO Jupiter missiles from Turkey.
We were 2 hours away from the end. 2 hours.
October 28th, 3 a.m. Moscow. The Soviets have an announcement to make. A personal message from Khrushchev to President Kennedy. This time, they use Radio Moscow rather than a Western Union telegram. Khrushchev announces that the missile sites will be dismantled and returned to the Soviet Union. Is the crisis finally over? President Kennedy puts off military action for one day while he waits for that day's reconnaissance photography to be examined.
The planes are out, and when we look at the photography, now they're pulling back. You could see that they'd pulled the missiles back, they had pulled the launchers out. It was obvious now that they had gotten the word.
Over the following months, 60 ballistic missiles and 134 nuclear warheads are dismantled and shipped back to the Soviet Union. Although serious tensions remain, one of the most perilous chapters of the 20th century is over.
The president's first drastic decision involved Cuba and resulted in the fiasco at the Bay of Pigs. The Eisenhower administration had bequeathed the new president a force of anti-Castro exiles, training in Guatemala for an invasion of their homeland. Under pressure from his senior advisors, Kennedy gave his approval to the invasion. The CIA had organized the training of the guerrillas and had forcefully advocated the invasion. The Joint Chiefs of Staff and the Secretary of Defense had approved its military aspects, and the Secretary of State had approved its political aspects. Yet, everything went wrong. The Bay of Pigs was a painful initiation, but its lessons were well learned. Thereafter, the president would rely less on the experts and more on his own people.
During the Cuban Missile Crisis in October 1962, President Kennedy asked the majority leader of the Senate, Mike Mansfield, the congressional expert on Southeast Asia, to travel to Vietnam and assess the situation on the ground and report back. His 18 December 1962 Foreign Relations Report, Volume 2, Number 330, on Vietnam, to the President essentially said, since its establishment in 1956, the Diem regime has become more dependent upon U.S. financial support and too narrow to survive. The base of government has not been deepened nor widened at all over the last 6 years, despite lip service to this regard. This is needed to carry the development of democracy throughout the country. Short of massive U.S. involvement with full-scale war against the North and the establishment of a colonial government, the U.S. may not continue to retain influence here. Vietnam, outside the cities, is still an insecure place which is run, at least at night, largely by the Viet Cong. The Diem regime has not won over the people in the hamlets and the villages.